What's going on, my fellow guitarists? My name is Andrew, and this is Andrew Rocks On. Today for the final chord category, we'll be learning the last 5 essential chords to play on the guitar. A, C, D, E minor, and G. If you watched any of my other chord tutorials, by the end of this chord lesson you will have learned the 8 foundation chords to play on the guitar, and you will be able to play a vast collection of songs. These are the chords that will be used most throughout your entire guitar career. However, you shouldn't look at them as easy chords. Look at them as building blocks to more advanced things as you progress. Okay, let's jump into our chords. Okay, now onto the chords. So this is the full C chord, and here's what it sounds like. As I've already taught this chord, I'll leave an annotation on screen to bring you through the new chords that are being taught, if you're only interested in learning them. So as you see on the chord diagram, the C is played with your first finger on the first fret and the second string, or the B string. So we're going 1, 2. Your second finger goes on the second fret on the fourth string, or the D string. 1, 2, 3, 4. Your third finger goes on the third fret, fifth string. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As we see on the chord diagram, there's an X on the sixth string. That means we don't play. Therefore, we strum from the fifth string down. That's your C chord. Like I've said in the previous 3 chord lessons, if you've seen them, it is important that you go through each of your chords and strum each string individually to check if they ring. If they buzz, there could be a number of reasons. We're going to look at some of these as we go through our C chord. Okay, so firstly we start with our 6th string. One problem that you may have is that your third finger is nudging up against the 6th string. So what you have to do is use the tip of your finger on your 3rd string and make sure it is not touching any of the other strings, and you should have a nice 6th string. With your 5th string here, it may be buzzing because your 3rd finger is too far back on the fret. So just make sure it's nice and as far up, as close to the next fret as possible. Also, make sure you're not using the flat of your finger like this. Make sure you're using the tip and pressing down as hard as you can. And you should have a nice 5th string. One problem with your 4th string may be your 3rd finger is nudging up against it. So just make sure, like the 6th string, make sure your 3rd finger isn't touching any of the other strings, and that should eliminate one problem. One other problem is your 2nd finger may be too far back on the fret, so just make sure it's as far up as it can be, and you should have a nice 4th string. With the 3rd string, it could be 2 reasons. Number 1, your 2nd finger could be nudging up on it and muting it, or your 1st finger could be nudging up on it and muting it. So just make sure both your 1st and 2nd finger are down on their strings, and make sure they're not touching any other strings, and you should have a nice open 3rd string. With your 2nd string, it may be because your 1st finger is too far back on the fret, causing it to get a muted sound. So just make sure it's nice and as far as it can be up on the next fret, and you should have a nice 2nd string. With the 1st string, it may be muted because your 1st finger is laying down and accidentally touching that 1st string. So just make sure using the tips of your fingers, and make sure your 1st finger isn't touching any of the strings, any strings other than the 2nd, and you should have a nice C chord. Now with the G chord. Like with the C chord, if you've already seen this explanation and want to skip to the new chords, there will be annotations on screen right now. Okay, this is what the G chord looks like, and this is what it sounds like. As we see on the chord diagram, your 2nd finger is played on the 2nd fret, 5th string. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then your 3rd finger goes on the 3rd fret, 6th string. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then your pinky finger or your 4th finger goes on the 3rd fret as well, and on the 1st string. With the G chord, we strum all the strings as we see there isn't any X's on the chord diagram. That's your G chord. Like I said with the C chord, strum each string individually to make sure your chord rings and sounds good. Let's take a closer look at our G chord. Okay, so firstly, your 6th string, it may be buzzing because your third finger is too far back on the fret, on the 3rd fret. So just make sure it's nice and close as it can be up to the 4th fret while still staying on the 3rd fret. And you should have a nice 6th string. Your 5th string may be muted because you're using the flats of your fingers on your 3rd finger here. And it may be accidentally coming down and muting and accidentally hitting that 5th string. So just make sure you're using the tips of your fingers on your 3rd finger and make sure it isn't touching any of the other strings. Also, it may be because your 2nd finger is too far back on that 2nd fret. So just make sure it's as close as it can be to the 3rd fret, and you should have a nice 5th string. With your 4th string, it may be because your 2nd finger here is nudging up on this string and accidentally hitting it. So just make sure your 2nd finger isn't hitting any other strings by accident. You should have a nice open 4th string. With the 3rd string, there shouldn't be any problem whatsoever unless your fingers are laying down really far, which is quite unlikely. So just make sure you're using the tips of your fingers on all of your fingers, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and your 3rd string should always sound good. With the 2nd string, it may be muted because your 1st finger is nudging up on the 2nd string from its position on the 1st string. So what you need to do is use the tips of your fingers on your 1st and make sure your 1st finger isn't touching any of the other strings except the one that it's supposed to be on, and you should have a good 2nd string. And then your first string, it may be muted because your 1st finger is too far back on that fret. So just make sure it's nice and as close as it can be up to the next fret. You're using the tips of your fingers, you should have a nice G chord. Now this is the D chord. Like I said with the C and G chords, if you've already seen this explanation and want to skip to the new chords, there'll be annotations on screen right now. This is what it looks like and this is what it sounds like. If we take a look at our chord diagram, it says we place our 1st finger on the 2nd fret and on the 3rd string. So 1, 2, 3. And then we place our 2nd finger on the 2nd fret, the same fret as our 1st finger, and on the 1st string. Finally, we take our 3rd finger and place it on the 3rd fret and then on the 2nd string. That's your D. With the D chord, we strum from the 4th string downwards as the 5th and 6th string are indicated by X's on the chord diagram. A good way I like to remember the chord is when you're looking at it from the fret front on, like the camera's positioned now. It kind of looks like an inverted letter D. At least that's how I remembered it when I was playing guitar. That's the D chord. Like I said with the C and G chords, strum each string individually to make sure your chord rings and sounds good. Ensure you're using the tips of your fingers and putting them as close to the next fret as possible. Also, make sure none of the flats of your fingers are touching any of the other strings. Okay, let's take a closer look at our D chord. So here with our D chord, one problem that may present itself on the 4th string is that your 1st finger from its position on the 3rd string here is coming up and accidentally hitting it, causing it to get this buzzing sound. So what you want to do is make sure your 1st finger here isn't touching any of the other strings, and you should have a nice 4th string. With your 3rd string, it may be muting because your 1st finger is too far back on the fret, causing it to buzz. So just make sure it's as close to the next fret as possible. Also, another problem that may present itself is your 3rd finger here could be nudging up against this 3rd string, causing it to mute. So we don't want that, so just make sure your 3rd finger is not touching any other strings, and you should have a nice 3rd string. With your 2nd string here, you shouldn't have much problem unless your 3rd finger is tightly grouped together with the rest of your fingers and it's too far back on this fret, right? So we just want to make sure it's nice and as close to the next fret as possible. That's actually one of the most common problems with D, that your fingers become too closely grouped together. So even if you have to use your other hand, just push it up towards the next fret. You should have a nice second string. With the first string, it may be muted because your third finger here is leaning down and accidentally touching this first string. So just make sure it's on that second string nice and firmly, and it's not touching any other strings, and you should have a nice first string. And that's the D chord. Now, on to our new chords. Firstly, we'll be covering A. This is what it looks like, and this is what it sounds like. If we take a look at our chord diagram, it says we place our second finger on the second fret, 4th string. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we place our third finger again on the second fret, but on the 3rd string, one below it, one below your second finger. Finally, we take our 4th finger and put it on the 2nd fret and the 2nd string, which is one below your 3rd finger. As we see on the chord diagram, there's an X on the 6th string, and this means we don't strum it. Therefore, we strum from the 5th string downwards. That's the A chord. To check that our chord sounds good, we have to strum each string individually to ensure it rings. Let's go over our A chord. Okay, so firstly, one problem that you may have is with your 5th string is that your second finger kind of wants to get away from your 3rd and 4th. So it's coming up and nudging up against this 5th string, causing it to have a muted sound. So just make sure your fingers here are closely knit together, and you should have a nice 5th string. With your 4th string here, maybe your second finger is trying to escape this this little lockdown here between your 2nd and 4th. So it may be coming up and nudging up against this 4th string. So just make sure it's nice and down on your 3rd finger's down on that 3rd string, and you should have a nice 4th string. With your 3rd string, it may be because it may be buzzing because it's too far back on the fret like this. However, that's unlikely because it causes the whole chord to move back, which means might even mean your 2nd finger here is going back on the 1st fret. We don't want that, so just make sure your 3 fingers are as close to the next fret as possible, and you should have a nice 3rd string. With your 2nd string, it may be because again, it may be because your finger is moving too far back on that fret, but again, it's unlikely because that would jeopardize the whole chord and the sound of the chord, because it'd be moving these fingers back on the 1st fret, so we don't want that. Just make sure your pinky is close up to that fret as possible, and you should have a nice 2nd string. With your 1st string, it may be because you're using the flats of your fingers on these chords, on these strings, I mean, and you may be accidentally tapping and muting this chord, this 1st string, sorry. So just make sure your finger is upright and your 1st strings to sound good. Also, another thing I want to mention about this A chord, you don't want all your fingers to be up and as close to this next fret as possible, because obviously that looks very cramped, and it's, I don't know, but I think it's a very, very uncomfortable position. So what you want to do is slide these back. It'll still sound good, but you want to have your pinky up against the next fret, as close to the next fret as possible, and then just layer your 2nd and 3rd finger diagonally from your pinky, so it's not as an awkward position as this would be. So just make sure they're diagonally layered. You should have a nice A chord. Last but not least, we have E minor. This is what it looks like, and this is what it sounds like. This chord is a fairly easy one. As we can see from the chord diagram, your 2nd finger goes on the 2nd fret, 5th string, or the A string. Then your 3rd finger then goes on the 2nd fret, 4th string, or D string. Simply put, your 3rd finger goes right under your 2nd. As we see on the chord diagram, there's no X's, therefore we strum all the strings. That's the E minor chord. Like we've done with all the other chords in this lesson, let's go through each string individually on our E minor to check out these our chord rings nicely. Okay, so firstly, with your 6th string here, it may be because your second finger is coming up and nudging up on that string, so just make sure it's your second finger isn't touching any other strings except the 5th string, the one that's supposed to be on. You should have a nice 6th string. With the 5th string here, a common problem is people are moving their fingers too far back on this fret. So you're getting a buzzing sound. So what you want to do is you want to take it as close as the next fret as possible, and you should have a nice 5th string. With your 4th string, it may also be because you're moving your finger too far back on this fret and it's buzzing, so just make sure it's nice and as close to the next fret as possible. You should have a nice 4th string. With the 3rd string, it may be because your 3rd finger is coming down and accidentally touching this 3rd string, and it may be muting it. So just make sure you're using the tips of your fingers and either of these fingers aren't touching any of the other strings. With the 2nd and 1st string, you shouldn't have any problem with them because, as you see, none of my 2nd and 3rd finger aren't even close to this 2nd and 1st string. So they should be always open unless you are, trying to bar almost this chord, which in that case you may be muting it. So just make sure you're using the tips of your fingers, and these, like I said with the last string, make sure these 2 fingers aren't touching the other strings, and you should have a nice E minor chord. So that is it for this chord lesson. Remember to practice your chords and ensure they don't buzz. Make sure they have a nice, clean ringing sound by going through and individually strumming each string to check if they ring. Also, practice your chord transitions between the 5 chords I've taught today, as they will be crucial to be playing the songs with these chords. Also, as always, remember to leave your thumb behind the fretboard as it builds muscles to play bar chords later on. In the description of this video or the playlist you're currently watching, there will be songs I'm going to teach you with the chords you just learned. Before you try to play these songs, remember to practice your chord transitions, as they'll be vital to playing these songs at the speed they're intended to be played at. If you enjoyed this chord lesson, leave a like, and please leave your comments and criticism down in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, guys, and until next time, peace. Howling like the swirling storms. I don't believe that anybody feels the way